Thanks for joining us on the first Cancer Has No Border podcast. I'm really excited about this first episode. Our first guest is Claire Saxton. She is the Executive Vice President of Insight and Impact at the Cancer Support Center, a global nonprofit organization that uplifts and strengthens people impacted by cancer. Our other guest is Dr. Mark Lanasa. Dr. Lanasa is a Senior Vice President and Chief Medical Officer for solid tumors.
Thanks for having us.
Great to be here.
So Claire, tell us a little bit about how you led the cancer support community and your experience with breast cancer patient advocacy.
So to talk about my experience with breast cancer patient advocacy, I actually have to go back to 1998 when I started with a small regional breast cancer organization that was just getting started. A group of breast cancer survivors got together and said, there's got to be a different way. We had to make a whole lot of decisions the moment that we were diagnosed. And we only heard from the doctors who had never had the treatment. So let's find a way to have patients know what it felt like from a survivor's point of view and how they got through and how they coped. And I had the honor of being their first full-time executive director and really learned from them what breast cancer, how it impacts not just the person who's going through treatment, their entire family, their relationships with other people, and also how it has a lasting impact for the rest of their life. And so I've been at Cancer Support Community for 8.5 years. I'm an executive vice president there, and so help lead the team, and we provide support, education, wellness classes across the country, both at cancer support communities and Gilda's clubs, and really look at what are the emotional needs of cancer patients. How do people cope? How do we share that information of how to cope? And how do we both help people with whatever their need is, as well as help them overcome barriers to getting care?
And how important is like a caregiver as part of this equation? I mean, that's such a huge role, right?
Yes, absolutely. Caregivers are a huge part of the whole team. And, one of the reasons that we're called Cancer Support Community is because that whole web of support is really important to the patient and to the family, because someone cancer turns your life upside down. If you're a parent, you aren't able to do everything for your kids. If you are helping elder parents with some of their daily needs, you're not able to help with that. And so having a caregiver both to help the patient during treatment, as well as to pick up some of those pieces that the patient has to drop because cancer has taken over their life.
Yeah. And Mark, tell me a little bit about your background. How did you move from academia into industry?
So I'm a physician scientist by training.
Okay.
I earned my MD and my PhD at the University of Pittsburgh and subsequently trained and became clinical faculty at Duke. Really enjoyed my time in patient care. My clinical practice actually was in leukemia and lymphoma. And what I observed was this real dichotomy that when I was in the hospital, I was taking care of patients who had acute leukemia. And in that setting, we were giving high-dose chemotherapy to patients to treat the leukemia. And that is so traumatic. There's so many side effects that the patients have to stay in the hospital for a full month. It's really, really difficult. Now, 25 to 35% of patients are cured from that. So it's certainly well justified, and it's miraculous and life-saving, literally, for patients who do have that level of benefit. Unfortunately, 100% of patients have that terrible safety experience, though, that they're in the hospital for a month. So, this was something that weighed on me, that to cure a third of the patients, we were making 100% of the patients really, really sick. At the same time, in my clinic, I was seeing patients who had more indolent disorders and was enrolling patients on clinical studies. And I saw the amazing impact that targeted therapies were having on patients. And I felt like this is the future. This is, by understanding the biology of cancer, we're going to come up with better, more targeted, less toxic therapies. And therefore, I really wanted to move to work full time on those types of therapies. So that was ultimately my main driver from moving from clinical practice to industry. Obviously, the clinical practice, what would patients do without the clinicians who are
Yeah.
out there? Have total respect for the work that they do. It's just that this is what's resonated for me and also resonated with my scientific background. The other piece that I thought a lot about was by working in this field, I really potentially can bring impact to patients that would be well beyond my sphere of clinical practice,
Yeah.
could help patients all over the world,
Well,
literally.
yeah, exactly. And then do you think about that day to day, kind of how many patients you're helping across the entire globe?
Um, I I guess the way I frame it isn't so much how many patients I'm helping. It makes it sound like it's about me, but really I feel gratified for the
Yeah.
impact that we can have and that all patients share that same experience, the emotional burden, the fear. So let's bring the benefit that we can with new medicines to all patients everywhere.
Yeah. Great. And so why is breast cancer research still so critical in today's medical landscape? Let's start with you, Mark. What do you think?
Um, because 2.3 million women were diagnosed with breast cancer around the world last year. It remains the most common cancer diagnosis among women around the world. Uh, Important advances have been made. Women are living longer with breast cancer, but it's also a leading cause of cancer death. So there's still significant unmet need. And I believe that by understanding the biology, we can continue to do better.
And maybe go into a little detail about what achievements that's been made over the past few decades, even just around breast cancer research.
Um, uh, it's been very, again, gratifying for me to see the transformation that's occurred in oncology care, even during my own career. When I was a clinical trainee, almost every patient was getting a different menu of chemotherapy tailored for their type of cancer, but
Mhm.
it was really chemotherapy backbone for everybody. Now we've moved into a totally different era of targeted therapies, immunotherapies, um, both oral targeted therapies as well as infused targeted therapies that have completely transformed cancer care. Breast cancer has really been on the leading edge of that transformation. So, yeah, I think that the protein biologics like Herceptin, small molecules, the estrogen degraders and estrogen blockers have made a tremendous impact to the care of patients with cancer.
And Claire, what is your thoughts on just patients? Like, what are they thinking? Like the patient advocacy groups and the patients about how far we've come in
So
treatments.
the long-term survivors can really understand how far we've come, because when I started in breast cancer patient advocacy in 1998, there were still some women who were getting bone marrow
Oh
transplant,
wow.
which is that high dose chemotherapy. So
Mhm.
basically, your immune system disappears, and that you need the transplant to give yourself back an immune system. And so one of the um, things that they did was try and see, more chemo, more sick. Does that actually make you better for longer? Because, one of the devastating things about cancer is there are plenty of people who, ring the bell when they're done with treatment and they hear that they're cured. And then 6 months, 2 years, 12 years later, get a diagnosis of it's back and it's spread to somewhere that means that you are going to live with this for the rest of your life.
Okay.
And so we have to find treatment. And if you run out of treatment, that's it.
Yeah.
And so anybody who's been through early stage breast cancer therapy and has felt the side effects of that will tell you, yes, we need more research so that we get treatment that is much more manageable. Anybody who's living with metastatic breast cancer that's spread to, the lungs, the brain, the bones, the liver, can tell you that, you know, they are always very interested in hearing what is the next potential therapy down the road. Because one of the things that is kind of insidious about cancer is that it changes its biology to, get around some of these treatments. And so eventually if you have metastatic disease, eventually your treatment is not going to work. So what's the next one? Because if we can keep it as we're treating this chronically, then we have started to see some people with metastatic breast cancer really be able to have fairly high quality of life and fairly good length of life. But we're just seeing that develop, and would love for advanced cancer, to be something that is much more chronically treated, and you're living longer and with a better quality of life.
And Mark, is that how you're kind of looking at it also when you're doing research as well?
Absolutely. So the bone marrow transplant experience is a really indicative history in the overall trajectory of breast cancer treatment in terms of this idea of chemotherapy works, intensify, intensify, intensify. And we learned that there really was not benefit to that. And therefore, really the future is targeting to
Yeah.
the biology of the individual patient's cancer, this tailored treatment. So that's absolutely the way that we're thinking about it, to understand what are the commonly dysregulated pathways, to block those pathways. And that also holds the promise of a better safety profile, better quality of life for the patient as well.
And I think a lot of people don't understand that we no longer say, oh, you have breast cancer, here is the treatment for breast cancer.
Yes.
With all of the innovations that have happened in the last decades, we are actually looking at, doctors are doing biomarker testing, they're doing genetic testing to figure out what is making your specific cancer grow and spread. And so, what are the kinds of treatments that will stop those biological processes that's keeping that particular kind of cancer growing and spreading?
Okay, great. And what challenges in breast cancer treatment and the research are you still trying to solve today?
We're still absolutely committed to understanding patients who are treated with early disease. What are the predictors and how can we prevent that late relapse? Um, in breast cancer, it's unusual among cancers in that we actually have an effective method for screening and detection through mammography and through self-examination. The majority of women are actually diagnosed with early stage disease. And as Claire mentioned, women will have treatment for early stage disease, perhaps have adjuvant treatment, but still today, 20 to 30% of patients will have a late relapse. How do we identify these patients? How do we give them a different type of adjuvant therapy that will hopefully cure them, but can keep them in a disease-free state for a longer period of time? In the metastatic setting, it's absolutely around identification of new targets
Yeah.
that are going to bring more benefit, longer benefit. I think, again, the chemotherapy experience, that if you just keep changing to different types of chemotherapy, ultimately there's diminishing returns and a terrible sort of toxicity burden for the patient.
Yeah. And are there any specific types of breast cancer that are more challenging that really require further research?
Breast cancer generally is broken up into three groups.
Okay.
There's the hormone receptor positive, cancers that express either the estrogen or progesterone receptor. There are women who have breast cancers that express the HER2 gene. And then there are women who do not express any of those three, and therefore it's called the triple negative subgroup. The triple negative subgroup, that group does have the worst outcomes because they have the fewest number of targeted therapies available
Yeah.
today. There are other more rare subgroups, so-called inflammatory subtypes of breast cancer, which can be a particular challenge. But again, we're looking for things that can bring benefit across the spectrum because even the lower risk patients are still experiencing these late relapses, and there's really an opportunity to improve standard of care across the entire spectrum of breast cancer.
And it's really interesting how the idea of what an aggressive breast cancer has changed since I first
Yep.
came into the breast cancer space, because Herceptin was fairly new. And so HER2 positive breast cancer was still kind of seen as a really aggressive breast cancer. But thank goodness we now have Herceptin. And now, because we have so many targeted treatments for HER2 positive and then the hormone receptor positive breast cancer, that triple negative group Now we're viewing that as one of the more aggressive, just because we don't have the treatments to actually keep it in check the way that we do with the other kinds. And
Okay.
so that certainly shows a, need for more research there. And the other thing is there's a health equity component to it. African American women are much more likely to be diagnosed with triple negative breast cancer, much more likely to be diagnosed at a later stage,
Yeah.
much more likely to be to die of breast cancer.
And what is the industry doing about that, though, to try to help those statistics be lowered? Is there more education being given to that demographic?
Certainly in the last 5 years or so, we've seen a lot more emphasis on how do we make it so that your zip code and ethnicity um, aren't the determinants of how how well you'll do in treatment, or how late you'll be diagnosed.
Okay.
And so there are quite a number of efforts out there from industry, from patient advocacy groups, from other kind of community groups that are looking at health equity to really try to get rid of those disparities in um, both diagnosis and in mortality. And there's it starting from early detection as well as, looking at previvors, people, if you have a family history of breast cancer, is your family talking about it? Did they get tested to see, is this a genetic form of breast cancer that can be inherited? And therefore, we should be thinking about special um, detection methods, special screening methods for you, and even some preventative therapies that you could take advantage of, like Angelina Jolie and others who have. And so there's a whole range of both from an education level of letting people know how important it is to get breast cancer screening and other cancer screenings, um, all the way through to what is there are there differences in biology, and can we learn more about that to come up with better treatments, and also getting more people in these underserved populations to be part of clinical trials so that when treatments are tested, we know that they work in these populations as well.
Yeah.
And so cancer support community actually has, and many patient advocacy groups have, efforts to really normalize the idea of being part of a clinical trial as part of your cancer treatment, because you can be getting some of the most innovative treatment if you're part of a trial.
I'd just like to echo the importance of the health equity piece and to reiterate that women of color are less likely to have mammography. They're more likely to have a delay in diagnosis. They're more likely to have a delay in initiation of treatment. Yes, the distribution of the subtypes is somewhat different, but ultimately they're more likely to die from breast cancer as well. So I think that there are two key components to this. So one is the biology is somewhat different. Women of color are more likely to have the triple negative subtype. But if anything, that should increase the urgency to make sure that screening is being done to limit any delay in diagnosis. So with this, there's a piece related to education. There's a education and awareness, actually undergoing screening. There's a piece related to support. There's a piece related to barriers to care that exist in our system. So all of these are important components that we want to address. And then from the industry side, of course, we're also very, very focused on understanding differences in biology and making sure the best treatments are available. One area of hope for the triple negative subgroup is that that subgroup probably is deriving more benefit from immunotherapy, which has had such a big impact across lots of different types of cancers. That subgroup probably derives more benefit. So it's important that, again, those patients have access to that treatment as early as possible.
So have you seen an improvement in kind of early detection over the past, let's say, decade?
So we had been seeing improvements in early detection, and then COVID happened. And people didn't go to the doctor and didn't get their regular screening anything. And so the last 3 years, we've really been focusing on getting people back to care, getting people back to those regular screenings, getting people back to their primary care for, their annual visit, because we've got to start with kind of getting back on track.
Getting in that routine again.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And just, do you think we're at a place where we need more effective treatments for advanced stages because maybe people are not doing the early detection as much as they should?
Yes. Again, we are detecting most cases of breast cancer in an early stage, and women are receiving that curative intent definitive therapy of surgery and radiation and sometimes chemotherapy as well. But unfortunately, there are a minority of women who are having late relapses, and absolutely we want to make sure that we have the best treatments available for those patients. There have been a number of new mechanisms that have been approved even over the last 5 years, inhibitors targeting genes called PARP, called PIK3CA. And really, what this enables us is that it enables us to really have a personalized treatment plan for individual patients. Certainly, I think that this is much more likely to be the tip of the iceberg than the end of the story. That different patients' cancers are caused and dysregulated in different genetic ways. And through the continued understanding of the biology, that's going to open up paths to new treatments. And this is what we're committed to working towards on the development side.
That's great.
And I'd love to jump in and just say that it isn't just people who relapse late. It's a small minority, but there are people who are diagnosed with advanced stage disease. They tend to be younger, and so not even fall in those screening categories where you would normally get a mammogram. And so there's definitely work to do there. I mean, how do we really figure out what is the best screening? Because our screening guidelines are all about somebody with average risk and what should the average risk person do. And anybody who lives with metastatic breast cancer will tell you that the whole idea of, oh, you had breast cancer, you fought it, and now you're cured, really is their reality is so different from that. And so it often the pink ribbons often infuriate those women because, no, I'm not going to have treatment and be cured. That is not the rest of my life. And again, anything that can be done, especially, in cases where the cancer has spread to the brain, that's one place where we've actually made some progress in terms of allowing them to be in clinical trials, because in the past, in order to keep the statistics simpler of, how does this drug that we're testing work, we were saying, well, if you have spread to the brain, you can't be in our clinical trial. Well, so then how are we ever going to find which drugs work best for people where the cancer spread to their brain? And so there's still a lot of work to do, and there's still women dying every day of breast cancer.
Can you talk a little bit about the impact that breast cancer research has on lives of patients, especially regarding quality of life and long-term outcomes?
So when I started in breast cancer, for the most part, it was chemo or chemo plus something else, chemo plus Herceptin, or chemo first and tamoxifen afterwards. And people have a fairly good sense of the side effects of chemo.
Okay.
They're not pretty. It's not something that people want to do, but it is something that, knowing that it will extend their life, people do, and they get through. But if we could get breast cancer treatment to much more, to improve quality of life, cancer really does turn your life upside down. And there's everything from, not you're feeling sick, so you're not able to interact with your community of support. And so you feel more isolated and you were already sick to begin with. And, now your hair is falling out and you had surgery where they altered your body and it looks different. And finding treatments with better side effect profiles means that people can be more of who they are every day. And whether that's being a mom to your kid and helping them get off to prom, or like helping your parents live with, getting older, or maybe it's playing tennis once a week. All of those things are part of who people think of who they are. And when cancer takes that away, it really is, there's grief in that. There's, and then there's huge economic impact when people get so sick from treatment that they can't work, that they need a babysitter to help take care of their kids because they're too sick to do that. And so anything that we can do in terms of quality of life improvement not just improves that patient's life, but everyone around them, because everybody is impacted from that person not being able to be the person that they want to be.
I think the way that breast cancer care has been transformed over the past 30 years speaks to the ability for patients to not only live longer, but to also live better. Within my role, I find what Claire has to say so powerful because she's speaking from that individual patient experience. Within my role, I'm looking at population level data, right? The aggregate data across hundreds of patients. I understand from my time as a provider that each one of those patients is an individual with an individual story. So there's something that's lost in the aggregate data. But when we look at that data, we understand that adjuvant ovarian suppression or hormonal suppression therapy for women with hormone receptor positive disease, yes, it causes side effects, menopausal-like side effects of bone pain and hot flashes, but it also prevents relapse. And that has been a really important step forward. The HER2 example is such an important example. That HER2 positive breast cancer, again, used to be the most dreaded type of breast cancer because it was so aggressive and because it had a predilection to spread to the brain. And then the advent of Herceptin was absolutely transformative because for the majority of patients, it's a very well-tolerated protein infusion, and it was highly effective. That this dreaded subtype of breast cancer was now controllable in the majority of women, even for patients who had metastatic disease for years. Absolutely transformative. More recently, the advent of the CDK4/6 inhibitors, again, for advanced patients with advanced disease that's hormone receptor positive, those patients would go back on endocrine therapy, but they had already had that generally for their adjuvant therapy. So having something new to take in the metastatic setting significantly extended not just quantity of life, but quality of life.
That's good.
And that's absolutely a priority, is that these new treatments, by being more selective in what we're targeting, we're not just trying to kill all the cancer cells with a cytotoxic, that they hold the promise of having a much better safety profile.
And that brings to mind both the fact that now some of these drugs are oral drugs. And think of the difference between you take 4 pills a day or 2 pills a day versus you have to go in every week for 4 hours to the infusion center. Just imagine the impact on your life and on your family's life.
That concludes part 1 of our Breast Cancer Conversation podcast. Be sure to follow us and subscribe to our podcast on Amazon, Spotify, Apple, or iHeart. You can also subscribe to the video version of the podcast on YouTube. Thanks so much.